Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel. In this particular episode, we want to deal with Matthew chapter 23, which is not your favourite chapter in the Gospels at all. I'm sure you've underlined nothing in it because there's nothing comforting in Matthew 23. Here we have Jesus showing up what is inside of the leaders of Israel, and he is letting the people see what is behind the facade of religiosity that's actually there. It is very shocking. There's nothing comfortable about it. And you have to remember that when John the Baptist confronted Herod and Herodias with their sin, he actually sealed his own fate. In Matthew 23, Jesus seals his own fate as well by pulling back the veil on the leaders of Israel and showing the people what is actually there. He's going to judge the leaders according to the Sermon on the Mount. Now, this is not a study that I'm doing with you, but I'm giving you a little bit of information. If you want to do a study, take the Sermon on the Mount and put Matthew 23 beside it, and you will find that according to the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, that is exactly how the leaders are judged, and they get 0 every single time. And Jesus is going to show the people that you cannot look there for leadership. You cannot look there for guidance. You cannot look there for teaching. You cannot look there for anything, because the temple is now a great dead thing. It's all over. And they won't realize it's over until the death of Jesus and the veil of the temple is torn from top to bottom. Therefore, they will realize that this is the violent end of the Mosaic era. If you go back to Matthew chapter 9, from verse 36 and 37, Jesus saw the crowds and he felt sorry for them because they were harassed and dejected like sheep without a shepherd. And he's going to show them here in chapter 23 why they are without shepherds. They actually are without shepherds, although the religion of Israel has so many people involved and so many people running the temple and running the liturgies and running the sacrifices and absolutely everything else. They have so many rabbis and all the rest of it, but they have nothing because the thing is dead. Now, again, if you want to do a bit of study on this, I want to take you back to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 34. And this was the time of the exile, and the people wanted to know why it was that God allowed the temple of Jerusalem to be destroyed at the time of the exile. And the prophet Ezekiel is the prophet during the exile. He's one of them. Daniel is another famous one. And it's in chapter 34 that Ezekiel tells them what was wrong, that if God allows his own temple to be pulled down, it's because there was something drastically wrong. And he alone could ensure that the people would recover from whatever it was that was wrong, hence the years in exile. So in Ezekiel 34, let me just read a few verses and I'll leave it to you to read the rest. The Lord said, "Son of man," that's to Ezekiel, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, shepherds, the Lord God says this, trouble for the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves." They're looking after themselves. Shepherds ought to be feeding their flocks. "And you have fed on milk. You have dressed yourselves in wool, and you've sacrificed the fattest sheep, but failed to take care of your flock." So you're taking care of yourself but you're not taking care of your flock. That was exactly the situation in Israel at the time of Christ. That the members of the Sanhedrin were all very wealthy. They were all landowners. They had loads of servants and maybe even slaves as well. They had all the privileges, but they didn't want any of the responsibilities. And then the people as a whole had moved away from them into worldliness and sin. There's a parallel in the church today, unfortunately. And so the Lord said, you have failed to make the weak sheep strong and to care for the sick ones. You have failed to bandage the wounded ones. You have failed to bring back the strays and look after the lost. On the contrary, you've ruled them cruelly and violently. For lack of a shepherd, he said, the people are scattered. They have become the prey of any wild animal. Well, that has happened in our own day as well, that the people have wandered off from the church and gone into all kinds of things that are very dangerous, all kinds of philosophies and stuff that are extremely dangerous. So the Lord would hold the shepherds actually responsible for that. Because when you study the Gospels and superimpose what's going on today as what was going on at the time of Christ, it fits very neatly, unfortunately. So chapter 23 is not a comforting reading at all. Matthew begins by saying, Jesus turned to the people. Now this is in the temple in Jerusalem. This is in the very heart of Judaism. This is on the priest's own ground. No wonder they told him he wasn't afraid of anybody. And he addressed the people and his disciples. Jesus has no interest whatsoever in the leadership because he knows that they have totally closed the door. And he turns to the people that there is hope of a future in. And that is his own disciples and the rest of the people who might still come back to him. And he said, the scribes and the Pharisees occupy the chair of Moses. The expression, the chair of Moses, means the position of authority, the right to teach. And they called it the chair of Moses because Moses was the first great teacher that they had. Because in their tradition, the rabbis would sit when they were teaching. And this tradition has been carried into the church. And we use the expression, the chair of Peter, meaning the right of the popes to teach. So Jesus said, you must do what they tell you. In other words, as long as Judaism was still in existence, that is up to the time of Jesus, is what Jesus is talking about. So if they order you to do something, you've got to do it. But do not be guided by what they do. So there's a huge difference between obeying an order from them and actually imitating them. He says, don't imitate them. They're completely wrong. They do not practice what they preach. Now, a religion dies when the people who are preaching the faith are not actually living it, because their emptiness is shown up to absolutely anybody who wants to look on. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders and won't lift a finger to release them. Now, the heavy burdens were the 613 rules that they made for the Sabbath day alone, and it was absolutely crazy. St. Peter confessed to the early church that none of them could actually obey these rules. And that left them in a position of condemnation all the time. And Jesus said, would they lift a finger? Not they. Now, we've already seen back in chapter 9 and chapter 11, Jesus' compassion. And Jesus said, come to me. I'll give you rest. I'll take these terrible burdens off you. So he was inviting them to come out of the old covenant and into the new covenant. And this wouldn't become history until Jesus actually had the new covenant cut in his own body on the cross. Everything they do is to attract attention. Well, if you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, Jesus condemns people who pray and do whatever else they do in religious circles just to attract attention. like wearing broader phylacteries and longer tassels, like wanting to take the place of honour at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues. This is all irrelevant stuff, but it was the kind of social scene that they had. And so these men were seen as the top of the social scale, and they were given all kinds of honour. And Jesus said it's nothing to do with religion. It's nothing to do with serving God. So they wanted to be greeted obsequiously in the marketplaces. In other words, they want people bowing to them and showing them honour and so on. But it doesn't mean anything. It has no value. It's irrelevant. You, however, he said, must not allow yourselves to be called rabbi. Now, this is actually very important, because when he's addressing the disciples, that includes the 12 and the 72, the people who are going to be the leaders as soon as he is risen from the dead. And the church begins to launch out into the deep of the Gentile territories. They're going to be the leaders, they're going to be the teachers, and he's warning them not to imitate what they have seen in the temple in Jerusalem. It has to be completely different to that. You are not to be called rabbi, since you have only one master and you are all brothers. So he wanted them to recognize themselves as a community, with Jesus still living among them, although not in the flesh. He'd be living among them spiritually. You must call no one on earth your father, since you have only one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor must you allow yourselves to be called teachers, for you've only one teacher, and that is the Christ. So he's asking them to continue on into the future as they are now, simple disciples, different functions given to them according to their call, but there isn't a first class, second class, and third class among them. In fact, he says, anyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and anyone who humbles himself will be exalted. So here we have the beginning of this terrible revelation about what was wrong in Israel that Jesus did not want to bring into the future. So we can understand from this, therefore, if you're doing a study on Matthew now, I could take you much further, but I'll just give you a hint. Because of what Jesus is saying now in the temple in Jerusalem, you can understand that back in chapter 15, he rejected the Jewish magisterium, and in chapter 16, he bestowed it on Peter. And here he absolutely rejects the teaching of these people. And when we look back at the Sermon on the Mount, the disciples realize that is the fundamental teaching for us. Okay, so Jesus had often said that these leaders were hypocrites. And that means that you teach and you do not practice. You talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk, as they say it nowadays. This hypocrisy of proclaiming something you do not live actually destroys religion. Let me give you an example. Supposing I am teaching you about forgiveness, and I give you all that the scriptures tell us about forgiveness. I can even give you examples of forgiveness, and it's all true. But if I don't forgive, I can't communicate the teaching of forgiveness. So let's say there's another teacher beside me, and this person gives you exactly the same teaching as I've given to you, because it's all right, the stuff that's in the scriptures, but this other person forgives everybody who has ever hurt them anything. That person has a spiritual authority to teach forgiveness that I don't have if I'm not forgiving. I want you to hear that clearly, because that is what's wrong with the scribes and Pharisees. They're not living it, and therefore they have no spiritual authority to teach it. If they're not living it, They also don't have spiritual wisdom given to them that deepens their understanding of what God actually wants. And what Jesus says, and what Ezekiel had said in chapter 34 of his book, was that these men were self-centered and self-serving in religion. And they had no genuine concern for the people. Instead, they burdened the people and merely crushed them. So, you need to know that what the people were actually getting in their everyday life was the Pharisaic interpretation of the scriptures, which was unbelievably detailed and was totally out of proportion. For example, with regard to the tithing, that they were all supposed to give a tithe to the temple, the Pharisees said, even the smallest herb in your garden must be tithed. That's absolutely ludicrous. That wasn't what the Lord intended at all. It was into this very burdensome situation that Jesus gave his mighty call to the people in chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who are overburdened by all these rules and regulations. But if you go to John chapter 7, verse 49, you will hear what the leadership actually thought of the people. They had themselves in a completely different bracket, socially and spiritually. They said, this rabble doesn't understand anything. They're going to be damned anyway. If that wasn't in John's gospel, I wouldn't believe it. So if they have that attitude towards the people, that no matter what the people do, they're not going to make it, that we're the only ones who can make it, then you can realize why Jesus is trying to correct this frightful imbalance that's there. Also in chapter 6, as I mentioned, ostentatious behavior is totally condemned by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And he forbade the leaders of his church to take titles and everything. You got this back in chapter 18, where they were told to be simple but wise. They were to be as wise as the serpent, but simple as children, meaning that there was to be no sinfulness in their lives. And so the key that Jesus gives to the Christian leaders, now he's teaching them by telling them what's wrong in the Jewish leadership so that they will have a comparison, so that they can say, oh, we can't, that's not what he wants, this is what he wants. And the key that Jesus gives them is that if you want to be exalted into high position and have people bowing to you and scraping to you and everything, God, for your own sake, will have to humble you. He will have to bring you down. But that the people who remain in the position of knowing that they're nothing in themselves and that they have nothing to give the people, they are not the Saviour, they are not the Lord, that the one who is the Saviour and Lord is Jesus, then the teachers who will lean on Jesus to give the teaching, they will be helped by the Lord and they will be exalted. Okay. Now, when you go back to chapter 18 as well, the leaders of the church were told that they had to give very humble, simple service. Like Jesus himself, he said, I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. So that is the standard for those who are going to be in leadership in the church. And on that basis, from verse 13, he pronounces 7 woes on the leadership of Israel. And it's actually very frightening, because a woe is a kind of a mourning for the death that you're actually looking at, and it means that this leadership is completely finished. Okay. So it indicates that there will be divine punishment coming to these people because of this. So the first woe is in verse 13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. That means you don't live this, you're only pretending. You shut up the kingdom of heaven in men's faces, neither going in yourselves nor allowing other people to do so. Now, if you remember chapter 18, the great scandalon was to block somebody else from being able to come to God. And so Jesus is saying that this is exactly what you're meeting with in the scribes and Pharisees, that their behavior is showing that they have actually prevented the people of God from actually coming close to God. In fact, they thought, as I said, that the people would never make it, that they were just sort of there. They wouldn't make it. And so this first woe indicates that they were a roadblock instead of a gate to heaven. Now, their ancestor Jacob, who was the ancestor of this people, had an experience in which he said, this place is the gate of heaven. And he called it Bethel, the gate of heaven. Now, if they were faithful to their ancestor and his faith, they would have used the temple and the worship and the teaching and everything to be a gateway to heaven for all their people. That is the duty of spiritual leaders, not being a roadblock to them. And so we heard in chapter 18 how serious it was to put such a scandal on before the people. So they have hardened their hearts against the Messiah and against the redemption that he brings. And therefore, what is waiting for them is God's justice, unfortunately. So the second woe is verse 15. Alas for you, or woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you who travel over land and sea to make even one proselyte, and then you make him even more fit for hell than yourself. Now this is very interesting, because in the years following the death of Jesus, the scribes and Pharisees saw so many Jewish people going over to the Christian idea and joining the Christian movement. And so they went all out in the very territories that the church had moved into. The church had moved north from Israel into Antioch, and they had moved into what they called Asia Minor. Today it's Turkey. And then they moved west towards Greece, and then Rome to Italy. They had also moved east into the areas known as Babylon and Persia, and they had moved south into the North African countries. And there was this huge activity going on. And these leaders were very shocked when they saw just how many Jewish people, apart from Gentiles, were joining this messianic movement. They weren't going to call it its real name. And so they made an absolutely a concerted effort to try and get some proselytes into Judaism. And this is very interesting, and the reason why I'm giving it a little bit of time is that when you go into the letters of St. Paul and you go into the Acts of the Apostles, you will find that it's these proselytes that actually give terrible trouble to the early Christians, because the early Christians are completely new to their faith in Christ, and these other people are completely new to their faith in Judaism, and so there's a mighty clash between them. And so the Acts of the Apostles show that some of these clashes ended up in real trouble and got Paul and Silas thrown into prison and tortured and everything. So this woe is actually very serious. And what Jesus says is that you will make the people who will come into Judaism worse than yourselves, because now they have this very negative approach to everything that God has been doing, and they will make these people very narrow-minded in their faith. And so we have to be extremely careful that if you offer the faith to somebody, that you're offering them the real thing, that you're offering them the treasure in the field. You're not offering them your own very narrow-minded approach to this. But unfortunately, the only thing we can give is what we have. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé libh. Goodbye. God bless you.